Hello and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rasool, and today we are speaking about the politics, economics and social dynamics of informal work, employment and unemployment. After the break, we'll be in conversation with Gabriella Razzano, who is the director of a civic tech organization called OpenUp, and is also the author of a new report called Working in the Shadows, When the Light is Nothing But a Torch. But before we have that conversation, we are going to have a look at a short video on informal work. Let's have a look.
Work is such a profoundly important thing for people, not just because it puts food on the table. It's profoundly important for their sense of self-worth. It's important for how they contribute to a community and a society. The kinds of work that people actually do to survive and demonstrate their resilience is not the kind of work that is either socially valued or politically valued. So the research centered the stories of 4 workers: a sex worker, a taxi driver, a domestic worker, and an Uber driver. It's not just that political tendency to ignore the kinds of work that people actually survive off, but the internalization for people of how their work is meaningless, and how their value as an individual is undermined because of the kind of work that they do. I think is very profound, and it's deeply unfair. There's a lot of work that we can do in the next 6 months in developing forms of simple contracting for domestic workers, or systems that make accessing unemployment insurance funds simpler for different kinds of workers. Having that written down and ready, we should keep our eyes on the prize and be ready to seize the opportunity when it arises, as it frequently does.
That was a short video on informal work and employment. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and today we are speaking about informal work and unemployment and employment. And joining us in studio is Gabriella Razzano, who is the director of OpenUp, which is a civic tech organization, but more importantly, who is the author of this amazing new report, which is called Working in the Shadows, When the Light is Nothing But a Torch. Welcome, Gabby. Do you mind if I call you Gabby?
Go ahead.
And thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So, Gabby, this report, and I'm going to do a disclaimer up front for the audience, that I did a little bit of work on this report for you, which was gathering sort of lived experiences of people. But before we go deeply into it, I want to bring up, so when we were discussing the scope of what this work is about, one of the things that was an aha moment for me, as someone who is, has been in employment for 20 years in different jobs, you gave a definition, or you explained how the law constructs what formal employment is and what that means for informal employment. So I'm just going to ask you, we don't think about that. We really read the fine print, we sign a contract, and we go work. Tell us a little bit about what constitutes formal employment.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to start off with is to understand, or to contextualize, that the majority of work that people do, in other words, the kinds of work that bring income into their homes, that feed their families, the majority of that work is not formal work. So the majority of the work that people actually do is either precarious or part-time employment or informal work. These are all different definitions, but basically are the kinds of work that are outside the bounds of how the law and policy constructs what constitutes work. And I think it's interesting to think of work that way, and it's interesting to think about how the very manner in which the law draws up boundaries is an artifice that excludes, or becomes an artifice that excludes, a whole lot of people who are doing a whole lot of different things to try and bring income into their homes. And what that means is the consequences of that is that frequently laws or policies that are put in place either don't help the majority of people who are working, or in fact deliberately exclude, the majority of people who are working, the realities of how they work. And I think it really inhibits the kinds of protections that are available for people, like through labor law and labor law regulation, but also when you think about, so a lot of the report is set in, it examines the COVID period. And so when you think about the kinds of policies that were put in place to either protect work or provide, different kinds of social protection, the majority of those kinds of protections didn't provide protection to those who needed it. And so I saw one figure from a quantitative study on COVID, which pointed out that TERS, which was the temporary employment relief, the TERS that have been put in place actually only covered 7% of people who'd lost their jobs.
Oh, wow.
Because, what constitutes a job, constitutes work.
So can I just ask a question about that? When I hear, for instance, that only 7% of people who had lost their jobs were covered by this fund, I would think maybe it is because there was not enough money. But I think what you're also saying is that a lot of people couldn't access this grant because what they had been doing before was not legally defined as employment within policy.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not exactly intentional exclusion, but it is, the result is the same, that the kinds of protections that people need are not available to them because of, these definitions. And obviously the law has a natural instinct, which is to create boundaries and definitions. The law's job is to create rights and impose obligations, and in order to do that, it needs to define who falls within the law and who falls outside of it. Specificity is important. It's just the nature of law that's how it works. But finding the gaps and understanding how the creation of definitions and boundaries of exclusion impact the lived experience of people is really, really important for trying to make better decisions about what law should look like, what policy should look like, but also what action should look like. Because it's not just about law and policy and regulation, it's also about how people organize themselves and how labor organizes itself, and the different forms of resistance that workers can lead to improve their conditions.
And that's the thing I loved about engaging on this project, is because there is such a huge disconnect between what I'm doing on the ground and with the law and policy and what it says and even definitions and so forth, and how that applies to me. And so often we'll find when people are interrogating issues at work and we start to understand how important these definitions are, is only once we experience, I'm going to call it an injustice, or something happens at work that is wrong. And we start to understand that this wrong is sort of, whether it is legally viewed as wrong or whether we have recourse depends on how our labor or our work is coded or defined and so forth. And you've already spoken, because I was going to ask you about why it's important to have this law, and you spoke about the rights and protections and obligations and so forth. You mentioned that this report was looking at the impact of COVID on informal work. And I want to say for the audience, when I was telling somebody else what the show was going to be about, I said, when we think of informal work, we're thinking about sometimes domestic work. People who don't have contracts, often that kind of work. So domestic workers who go in and work possibly for a day rate. Some taxi drivers, I don't know if you have a better definition for us to look at, like how broad is informal work and what it is?
Well, I mean, there are literal definitions for informal work, but in this report, I actually looked more at are different kinds of precarious work. So it's not just informal work is a specific kind of work, often seen in informal trading and those kinds of things. But also, there's a whole genre of precarious work, which is works on short contracts. Not, in other words, there is a vast array of work outside waged labor, like full employment.
So when I was studying, and I worked at a big grocery retail brand, this concept of permanent casuals, we had that. So these were people who were not permanent and they didn't have access to any benefits or whatever, but they were permanently there.
Yeah.
They had worked there for years and years.
Yeah.
That's sort of like one of those examples, right?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, and when you look at that, there's an interesting phenomena, and that's why I think everything needs to, you have to place the stuff in context, both historical context and political and economic context. And that's because the law is good at some things and not at others. And, there were big gains done, in previous years on rendering labor brokers and labor brokers as a means of trying to circumvent labor legislation, so people would hire through labor brokers and those kinds of things. And there are a whole lot of new sets of rules put in place to try and avoid people, avoiding their responsibilities to people who are actually employees through law. But there are many ways to circumvent that. And that's part of the limitation of law and regulation, that really, you can't detach. Just creating rules, often gives people, a new boundary to work around, and that's why you have to look at the same time, and the courts often say this as well, at creating the political structures and forums, that allow for people to exert power in a workplace through a whole lot of different ways than just through law. Because really it's about power and the relationships between employers and employees, whether you want to call them employees or not. And there's a historical context which is, seen in capitalism, that, people try and make profit through reducing what they pay workers. Like that's, it's the classic. And so laws and regulations only go so far. And that's why these different kinds of things, like looking at trade unions, looking at different ways that workers organize, but also looking at those structures, those really interesting labor structures that South Africa has in place, like NEDLAC and those kinds of forums. Those political structures are also really important. And that's why it's not just about changing what we consider to be work. In other words, changing the legal definitions or the regulatory definitions that mean that policy will work better or law will work better. It's also a social project and a political project of changing what work is valued and changing who counts. And that's a political and social exercise before it's a legal one.
I really like that, because I don't think we think hard enough about how much work means to us, right? And we're going to go into later sort of, how work informs our identity and so forth, and how it is a social exercise and a political exercise before it's an economic one. I want to come into so you've done this report. What was the basis, I think, for you going into looking at this topic? What did you hope to sort of unpack here?
Well, so I've been working in, this was part of, it's connected to stuff I've done with the Atlantic Senior Fellows in Social and Income Inequality, which is associated with the London School of Economics. So I've been doing a fellowship for a number of years, which looks at social and income inequality, largely in the space of data and digital governance and human rights, which is, so the nonprofit I run, OpenUp, is, you know, a civic technology institution, but also looks a lot at open data and digital rights and those kinds of things. And that intersects a bit with some of the work on looking at gig work, and, you know, the role of technology as both an enabler of workers and also a disenfranchise of workers. And you know, there are lots of specific discussions that can happen around there. But, you know, I think very early on in the COVID pandemic, you could see that it was fundamentally, for the lived experience of South Africans, very early, a job crisis, an employment crisis, an economic crisis, as much as it was a health crisis. And you can see that in how people talk. You can see that in you know, the pain that people experienced. And so, you know, a desire to look at that in a little more depth, by centering the lived experience of the different ways that people work and what COVID meant to them, seemed very important to me.
And so, I mean, what was really interesting was when we think about COVID, and you spoke earlier about grants, you spoke about rights and protections, when we sort of pull out then these informal employees and informal work, there were essentially no rights and protections for them. They just got cut off. Okay.
And it was interesting to see that, you know, the most job losses were actually experienced in the informal sector. And that's a real anomaly when you consider, you know, in other third world countries or developing countries, what the role of informal economy is. The positive role of the informal economy is that it provides, you know, work and income to people when there are shocks, economic shocks and disasters. And so the fact that at the time of incredible economic and social shock, it's in fact the informal sector that was most hard hit by job losses, I think goes to show you the real way that policy and law in South Africa is constructed, not just to promote formal work, but actively discourage and disempower informal work, in spite of the fact that there are, you know, many ways that informal work can transition to formal work, but also like just helps people survive, which should be, you know, the first priority, right, when we consider what it is we want to do in terms of governance of people. Yeah.
Gabby, I want to ask you, you used the term earlier to describe sort of informal work or different types. You said precarious work. And I wanted you, if it's possible, to just expand a little bit on that. Like, what does it actually look like? Because I think there's a lot of us out there who are working who might not even be thinking about whether the type of work we're doing is precarious or not. Like, for example, the permanent casuals. As I remember I didn't go in thinking about any of this. I didn't know any of the definitions. We're not taught that at school. It's just finish school, you know, study if you do, get a job. And that job is going in for X amount of hours, usually 8, and then getting paid. We're not even anticipating sort of economic shocks like this. I love that you used the example of COVID is not just a health crisis, but also an employment crisis. So could you expand just a little bit on precarious work?
Yeah, I mean, precarious work is a term I abuse very, very willingly, and it's just to refer to the different kinds of work that exist outside the bounds of formal employment. But you know, I like the term precarious. They talk about the precariat in economics. In other words, that's the group of people on the cusp who are constantly on the cusp of dropping into poverty, and how big our precariat is in South Africa. And the idea of precarious work, I like the term because it is this lack of protections, you know, no UIF, no permanent contract, you know, so in other words, you know, limited rights to, claiming unfair dismissal in the cases of retrenchment or whatever, not being involved, being able to join unions, because you don't formally belong to a sector or whatever. It's the lack of these kinds of rights that makes the lived experience, employment experience of the majority of workers precarious. You're constantly on the cusp of nothing. Do you know what I mean? You're constantly on the cusp of disaster. And
wow, and that's really deep. And then in the recent report, you do go through and you speak about how that, when you talk about centering the lived experience, how we experience life, how people experience life living on that cusp, being consistently vulnerable. And that's also one of the things you say. The vulnerability is that you could often just get fired with no recourse.
Yeah, and you're just so subject, and you see a lot of these discussions, really important discussions on intersectionality and inequality, and the different ways that different qualities of a person lead to their unequal experience, but also the different ways that systems intersect to make your experience unequal and your experience more difficult. And I think, for example, there was in the case of the domestic workers story we told, and I think about this a lot. She was talking about trying to. She's no longer legal, and she was talking about trying to go to the Department of Home Affairs to renew her papers, and how part of what transpired to, do you know what I mean, to get her destroy her status, let's put it that way, because I can't think of the English words. A part of what happened was that she took off one day of work, which isn't paid, right? Because she has no formal contract. Now, let's be clear, domestic work is meant to be formal work. There are laws in place which prescribe, the contract, the terms and conditions. And again, this shows you, yet the actual experience is one largely of informal work or at least being, part-time work or whatever. But anyway, and she was discussing how that bureaucratic inefficiency makes her so vulnerable because her employer won't let her take a second day, or she can't afford to take a second day to go stand in a queue in order to have her papers sorted out, and that intersects with a whole lot of different things. And I talk a little bit about beneficial visibility and how we're visible and invisible in different senses or whatever. But one of them is to think about bank accounts. Maybe if you belong to ABSA, then you can go get your papers done that way. But
yes, I love that you use that example, because often also in gender-based violence, when we speak about, so for example, child maintenance, the bureaucratic inefficiency means that women are approaching the court for money, but have to take multiple days off work. We have to take a short break, actually, but we will be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we're having such a great conversation around employment, informal work, precarious work, and unemployment. And joining us, still with us in studio, actually, is Gabriella Razzano, who is the director of OpenUp, a civic tech organization, and also the author of this report, Working in the Shadows, When the Lights is Nothing But a Torch. I'm trying to read that upside down.
I should have done it. It should have been put there.
In the shadows, when the light is nothing but a torch. Actually, you know what? I want to go in. Let's go into the second segment. Tell us about that title.
I mean, although I must admit, when I told someone, they're like, that is too long, and I needed to chat GPT it.
Like, I thought they might have said it was too soft.
Soft, interesting. No, too long. And then they were like, what does it mean? And the essential premise is kind of what I was talking about earlier, which is just the idea that, wherever there is light and advantage and protection, that is very limited in the South African context in terms of workers and the kinds of workers that exist in that beam, and that the majority of people who work bring in income, whether or not, through the kinds of labor we think are valuable or not. They live largely in the shadows. Shadows of protective legislation, shadows of protected regulation, the shadows of political institutions put in place to give workers power. And so that's where that comes from. It is a bit long though. We can think of an alternative one.
But it's printed already.
I know.
No, I love the title, and I love also bringing in this concept of shadows. I think the term shadow, I've been seeing it a lot lately, in terms of, and it's just speaking about that invisibility, right? So we're talking about the shadows, we're speaking about invisibility. We know now they're speaking about the internet, and they're talking about shadow bans. So where your posts are sort of being removed or flagged, and it's saying for policy, but it's not actually, it's more for like personal reasons, or just because they don't like it or it's sensitive. It doesn't actually break actual policy.
Yes.
And so this topic of the shadows is really, really interesting and important. I love the way that you are building this bridge between the personal and the political, which is often so removed. And so, before the break, you were talking about context and definitions and how that's important to what is protected and how things are defined. There was something really interesting in this report, and I'm shifting over a little bit here to unemployment, right? So we know we've got high unemployment rate. I would venture to say we have an unemployment crisis right now. I mean, globally already, there's lots of talk about graduates, even from tertiary institutions, who cannot find work or are working as waiters in precarious employment. But just a lot of people are just not working. And one of the personal aspects that I really appreciated in here was you draw this attention to perceptions of unemployed people, right, as lazy. And we know this happens in families. We know that this happens in communities. We know that this happens in our circles, that people are often blamed directly for unemployment. You again build this bridge to the political, where you say the perception of people who are formulating policy as unemployed people being to blame for their own unemployment, or it's those people being lazy, that also informs that the way the policy is created. Could you tell us just like a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll talk a little discreetly about, kind of values and perceptions and in unemployment. And I remember one of the most remarkable learning curves for me. I had many jobs in university because I was psychotically ambitious. And one of the jobs I did was working on a panel study where they monitored the lives of youth over a number of years. Really, really interesting. And that was the first time where I saw in the data, in the results, the idea that the majority of people who aren't looking for work don't do so because it's too expensive to look for work. And, I know Stats SA has also tried to tweak definitions of employment and unemployment to consider things like that. And that was just an incredibly enlightening moment for me, because it talks to the structural ways that we're excluded from employment. We don't live close enough to where employment is because of, apartheid infrastructure and those kinds of things. We don't have childcare because we can't afford to have childcare. And so eventually it becomes more valuable to not simply sit at home. Let's also not underestimate, let's not also underestimate that a lot of work is not viewed as work. that's largely domestic.
Yeah,
you know.
so a lot of people who are unemployed are not just sitting at
Yeah,
home. They are doing a lot
They're
of
doing
things.
work,
Yeah.
that contributes economic value to their families. I mean, that's another conversation. But yeah, I think people, they're structurally excluded from being employed. It's in no way a reflection of value. And, you just think about how hard unemployed people work. And I mean, one of the most heartbreaking things to me is to see people who sit on the side of the road all day on the off chance that, you get a day's work. You'll stay for weeks. I mean, and it's the indignity of that. Do you know what I mean? The indignity of how people are excluded from work that I find particularly enraging. And I was reading a great article in the New York Times, which was looking at the indignity in the experience of being unemployed in South Africa. I mean, that's how indicative this is of it being embedded in the very fabric of South Africa now, that these are, New York Times articles are exploring the stories of young people and the indignities they suffer in trying to find work, running from this place, running from that place, constantly ignored. That's a personal experience.
My cousin was unemployed recently, and he spoke about, and he was in what you could call formal employment with a desk and office and phone and so forth. And so he found himself unemployed, and he was really desperate. And he's an older, my age, older.
Well, careful.
So, but he was just speaking about like even walking. So he's really desperate, and he walks into a Stodels, and I want to tell the story because I want to acknowledge the people out there who are looking and who are experiencing these types of indignities, and someone comes to him, and tries to help him, but as soon as he says the words, "Oh, I'm here to see if you have any openings," the demeanor of the person just changed. There was also another story. There was one, and he's very funny, so he told these stories in a really funny way. But he also told the story of how it was clear that someone on the other end of the phone had thought he was white because of the way he sounded and his name. But when they met him in person at the interview, things really shifted. And so all of those little things build up into microaggressions, if we want to call it, of indignity.
Yeah.
And I also just want to acknowledge that one of the ways I'm really trying to think about it now, trying to expand my own view of what is work. So when women come to the door, especially a lot of them are women, sometimes with their kids, come to the door for food or for change or whatever, I just think that's how much labor. How much labor does that take to walk the streets and knock door to door for something to eat, right? And we don't think about work that way. I went through. So you're talking about structural impediments to finding work, and you gave sort of some examples. So one is, I often say, looking for a job is a job in itself, right? So it costs money, but also all the things that you have to do. You can literally sit the whole day sending out CVs, writing cover letters, etc. You interviewed some case studies centering the lived experience. So you brought in that. You spoke to a sex worker. We spoke to a sex worker.
We did.
A sex worker, a taxi driver, an Uber driver, and a domestic worker. And there was one, again, just an example to pull out, which was really interesting, and I think also speaks to structural impediments. So if we're looking at taxi drivers, this was really interesting. Here's where the law is clashing in terms of what he described. One, he said, you can get a permit to be a taxi driver. The job of taxi driving is legally recognized, but there is no infrastructure, so they are being heavily fined, and they are having their taxi vans removed sometimes because they don't have, now by infrastructure we mean the buses have bus stops.
Yeah.
We think when we they just stop anywhere they want to, but actually they don't have anywhere to stop. And so wherever they stop, they can be fined.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of the ways that, policy doesn't just maybe not include, it actively inhibits different kinds of work. And, I refer to de facto criminalization of different kinds of jobs. And I think the taxi industry has a lot of great examples of where that happens. And I read a really interesting, well, no, I didn't read the whole thing. I read a report about a PhD, I should be honest. I read a report about a PhD, which I thought was really interesting to add a different layer of the kinds of structural ways that we exclude. And it was talking about taxi drivers and unhealthy food. It was, I just really loved it. I thought it was so interesting because when you start to think of taxi drivers as a large body of workers who aren't really unionized, right? Who don't have a collective bargaining power, maybe, informally, but anyway, that even the urban planning doesn't consider taxi drivers. So the only kinds of food that are available, because you have these sort of ad hoc developments of infrastructure, are like highly fatty foods, that lead to real health challenges. And I know that's a discrete thing. I know it doesn't seem important, but I think it's really interesting. It's really interesting to think about how if you center a worker and you center their value, like this PhD does, how it completely changes the way that you view infrastructure, investment, and like justice.
Yeah. So as a person outside of just their job and their work identity, they are a human being who, because there are two things I wrote down here when we think about taxi drivers, for instance, it's toilets, right? So where do they go to the toilet? And is there infrastructure? And the other thing is like, it's a really sedentary, like they're sitting for extremely long periods of time while they're driving. And that also has like these health consequences. Gabby, I want to ask, what do you hope that people will take, I think, out of this report? Or how do you think it will shift like our thinking? And I think also just looking at, we're having this discussion, the audiences at home, who are either working, are in precarious work, are looking for work. How do you think this will shift? How would you like this to shift people's thinking and how they think about work in relation to themselves and lived experience? And also, I think, so themselves, lived experience of working, and also then how to start thinking about, policy in relation to their work.
Yeah, I think if we widen the frame with which we view work and what should be constituted as valued work, and I mean that's socially valued, because ultimately what is socially valued becomes economically valued, not necessarily always, but it's certainly a first step to, I think when we start widening our perspective of what is valued work, and start centering that, the way we engage with each other, the way we engage with different kind of workers in our everyday life changes, and that can be profoundly powerful. If we can shift even slightly how one middle-class white woman views her domestic worker, and the contribution that work is to an entire extended family, you can create real change that often the law and policy, can't create, certainly not create tomorrow, and not create quickly. So there are, I think, it opens the door to compassion and humanity, which is, it might not necessarily change everything. I mean, because employment is there are structural problems with employment in this country, but it's certainly a start.
And so I think that's just lovely, and I think just like following on from this very long title, as you call it, it's just also there's a huge emphasis on dignity. And I think a comment I want to make at the very beginning, what I loved about it is that we are all human, and it's really centering on that, beyond our work identities and our labor, but you know, we are all human and we all deserve really dignity in whichever process we are employing. Yeah. And was that something you were hoping to come through?
Well, I mean, that's probably, I'm revealing my constitutional law background in that, you know. I think there is one of the more profound things of South African jurisprudence, legal jurisprudence, is the way that our constitution and our very articulation of why we have rights and what rights are is rooted in the concept of human dignity, or dignitas, which is the only Latin word I remember from law school. But you know that those rights and our respect for those rights are rooted in human dignity. And that's the dignity that it owed to you for being a human being, not a particular type of human being. And I think, you know, there is some greatness in South Africa's constitutional law, and that's one of them.
We have 2 minutes. I think I want to just conclude with then, you know, this report is very important. Do you hope, you know, how do you hope that it will inform also policy and policymakers, government, and so forth? What impact do you hope it will have there? Big question for all at the time.
Well, you know, worker-centered policy. It's kind of an articulated of user-centered design, which you'll be quite familiar with from our sort of technology backgrounds, but worker-centered design, I think, is an important part of, I think there are creative ways you can approach policy. The creative ways you can approach anything. And I think starting from there is a good start.
I love that. And I love that it's something that also, it's a concept that we can also share out there with people who are employed themselves, so they can start thinking about what does worker-centered design look like, or worker-centered policy looks like. Gabby, that's us for today. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing all of this information with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everything you did for me.
Right. So we are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we've been having a great conversation on the economics and politics of employment and informal work. Now, we are almost at the end of our hour together, but before we go, we're going to have a look at a short video to round off our conversation. Let's have a look.
İnsana yakışır iş. Çalışma şartlarını düşünebilirsiniz, imkanları düşünebilirsiniz. Sosyal imkanlar olsun, maddi imkanlar olsun. Tabii ki bunların bir insana yakışır seviyede olması en doğrusu olan.
Yani tabii ki insanın onurunu kırmadan, gücünün üstüne çıkmadan, sağlıklı ortam, sana insan gibi davranmak.
İnsana yakışan iş kere en başta kendisini çalışırken huzursuz etmeyen, yani kendisini mutlu hissettiren, çalıştığı iş yerde problemlerinin çözüldüğü, kendisini dinleyebilecek bir insanların olduğu, çalışmada arkadaşlarının kendisine destek olacağını bilmesi en önemli şey.
altı çalışma diye anlaşılıyorsa personelle, senin sigortan, hakların, ücretin, maaşın bu diye konuşuluyorsa onun doğrultusunda sözden çıkmadan gerekli güvenle verilen doğru iş diye düşünüyorum.
Bana göre insana yakışır iş, karşıdakine hiçbir şekilde dil, din, ırk ayrımı yapmadan, özellikle bir işveren olarak hiçbir şekilde ayrım gözetmeksizin çalışanlar arasında bu dengeyi sağlamak.
İnsana yakışır iş dediğimde insanların emeğinin sömürülmemesi aklıma geliyor.
Senden de söylemeni rica ediyorum.
Buyurun.
Herkes için insana yakışır iş.
Herkese için insanlara yakışır iş. Bir daha söyler misin?
Buraya bak. Sakin. Tamam.
Dur, su içebilir miyim?
Tabii ki içebilirsin.
Herkese için insana yakışır işe. Oldu mu?
Peki herkes için insana yakışır iş. Bunun olmadığını fark etsem gizli kamera yok muydu ya?
Kaldım böyle.
Kalbin mi çarptı?
Türkçe biliyorum ama bazı kelimeler ağır geliyor bize.
Haklısın.
Tamam bir daha yapalım. Aynen sen olsun. Herkes için insanlara yakışır iş.
Ay niye söyleyemiyorum ben?
Yapma bak terledim yani yeter. Herkes için insana yakışır iş. Ama bak ay düş gidip alayım ben.
Herkes için insana yakışın iş. Bitti mi?
Her vardan sonra bakmayın yani. Herkes için insan yakışır iş.
Atasözü mü bu arada? Slogan.
Herkes için insana yakışır iş, özellikle kadınlara.
Herkes için en güzeli dur. Herkes için en önemlini dur. Herkes için yaşlı insana iş. Herkes için
İnsana yakışır iş.
insana yaşıklı iş.
Tamam, sağ ol.
Teşekkür et abla.
That was a short video to round off our conversation on unemployment and informal work. And that's all we have for today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lenina Rasool. Goodbye.